$10 million. How can it continue to reshape everything when a simple bridge becomes the line between trust and doubt, between hope and hidden intentions? The road was no longer the only thing changing in the village. What Jack had started with the road had sparked something bigger: expectations, pressure, and a silent question lingering in every corner. What would he do next? The answer came sooner than anyone expected. At the edge of the village, where a narrow, unstable wooden crossing once stretched over a shallow but dangerous stream, a new construction had begun. For years, the children of the village had to carefully balance themselves across that fragile structure just to get to school. During the rainy season, the current grew stronger, the wood became slippery, and every step carried risk. Jack had seen it once. That was enough. Now, standing at the site, he watched as workers carefully secured the final sections of a solid wooden bridge reinforced with metal supports. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't designed to impress. But it was strong, safe, and permanent. "This has to hold," Jack said firmly to the supervisor. "No shortcuts." The man nodded. "It will. Stronger than anything here before." Behind Jack, a small group of villagers had gathered again. As always, there were mixed reactions. Some curious, some hopeful, others quietly skeptical. Tu Tien stood nearby, her eyes focused not on the structure itself, but on the people watching it. She could feel the tension beneath the surface. "You're building more than a bridge," she said softly as she stepped beside Jack. Jack glanced at her. "I know. You're building expectations," she added. Jack didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked toward the children standing at a distance, their eyes wide with excitement as they waited. "Among them, be me." She stood at the front, holding tightly onto the strap of her worn bag, her gaze fixed on the bridge as if it were something unreal. Jack noticed her and gave a small nod. "She should be the first." Tu Tien smiled faintly. "She deserves it." A few minutes later, the worker stepped aside. The bridge was ready. The moment felt strangely quiet. "Go ahead," Jack said gently, looking at me. The little girl hesitated for a second, then slowly stepped forward. Every eye in the village seemed to follow her. Her small foot touched the new wooden surface carefully, testing it. It didn't move. She took another step. Then another. And suddenly, she was walking, not with fear, but with growing confidence. By the time she reached the middle, her face lit up with a smile so bright it seemed to dissolve the tension in the air. When she reached the other side, she turned back and shouted, her voice filled with joy, "It's safe." For a brief moment, something shifted. People began to murmur, not with suspicion, but with something closer to belief. Some even smiled. But not everyone. From the back of the crowd, Truong Thon Pao stood silently, his expression unchanged. His eyes weren't on the bridge. They were on Jack. Later, as the crowd slowly dispersed, Pao approached him. "You're good at this," Pao said calmly. Jack looked at him. "At what?" "Making people believe," Pao replied. Jack didn't react immediately. "I'm not making anyone believe anything. I'm just doing what needs to be done." Pao stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly. "That's what makes it more dangerous." Jack's gaze hardened slightly. "Helping people is dangerous?" "No," Pao said. "But power disguised as kindness is." The words hung in the air between them. Jack held his ground. "If you think this is about power, then you don't understand me." Pao studied him for a long moment, then gave a faint, unreadable smile. "Maybe. Or maybe. I understand more than you think." Without another word, he turned and walked away. Jack watched him go, feeling the familiar tension return. Tu Tien stepped beside him again. "He's not going to change easily." "I'm not trying to change him," Jack said quietly. "I'm trying to prove something." "To him?" she asked. Jack shook his head slightly. "To myself." But as he said it, even he wasn't sure if that was entirely true anymore. Because things were already getting more complicated. Unbeknownst to everyone in the village, another pair of eyes had been watching, not from afar like before, but much closer this time. At a small roadside stall just outside the village, a man leaned casually against a wooden post, a faint smirk playing on his lips as he looked toward the newly built bridge. Dressed simply but carrying an air that didn't quite belong to the place, he took a slow sip from a cup in his hand, his gaze sharp and calculating. "So it's true," he muttered. "Jack really gave it all up, and now he's playing the hero." His phone buzzed lightly, but he ignored it. Instead, he kept watching. $10 million, he continued under his breath. That's not just luck. That's opportunity. A faint laugh escaped him. "Let's see how far you've changed, Jack." Back at the bridge, Jack stood with Tu Tien, watching the children now running back and forth across it, their laughter echoing through the air. For them, it was just a bridge. For Jack, it was something more. A symbol. A promise. A risk. Tu Tien looked at him once more, her expression softer now, but still carrying a trace of concern. "You're doing something good," she said. Jack nodded slightly. "I hope so." But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the village and the newly built bridge, neither of them noticed the man standing in the distance. Watching. Waiting. And planning his next move. $10 million, how can it continue to reshape everything when trust has only just begun to form, yet danger is already moving quietly beneath the surface? The bridge stood firm under the fading light of the evening, its structure glowing faintly under the orange sky, while the laughter of children slowly dissolved into the calm of night. To most people in the village, it was a good day, maybe even the beginning of something new. But for a few, it was only the start of something far more complicated. Jack remained near the bridge long after the others had left. He stood there in silence, his hands resting lightly on the wooden railing, feeling the solid strength beneath his fingers. It wasn't just about the structure. It was about what it represented. "You're still here," Tu Tien's voice came softly from behind. Jack turned slightly, offering a small smile. "Just making sure it's real." Tu Tien stepped closer, looking at the bridge, then at him. "It is." Jack exhaled slowly. "For the first time, it feels like I'm doing something that actually matters." Tu Tien didn't respond right away. Instead, she studied his face carefully, as if searching for something deeper beneath his words. And for the first time, she said quietly, "I'm starting to see why people are afraid." Jack frowned slightly. "Afraid of what?" "Of you," she answered honestly. Jack let out a soft, disbelieving laugh. "That doesn't make any sense." "It does," Tu Tien said. "You walked into their world and started changing everything. Roads, bridges, their lives. People don't know what comes next. And when they don't understand something, they fear it." Jack leaned back against the railing, his expression thoughtful. "So what am I supposed to do? Stop?" Tu Tien shook her head gently. "No. Just, don't expect everyone to trust you at the same speed." Jack nodded slowly. He was beginning to understand that change wasn't just about action, it was about time. But time was something he might not have as much of as he thought. The next morning, the atmosphere in the village had shifted again. The bridge had become the center of attention. Children crossed it repeatedly, laughing and calling out to each other, while adults walked more carefully, testing each step as if still unsure it would hold. But the conversations had changed. "He built the road, and now the bridge," someone said. "What's next?" "I heard he still has most of the money left," another replied. "Or maybe he's already planning something bigger." The curiosity was growing, but so was the suspicion. At the edge of the gathering, Truong Thon Pao stood once again, his gaze fixed not on the bridge this time, but on the people. He watched how quickly opinions were shifting, How easily trust could form when people saw results. That's how it starts, he murmured under his breath. Meanwhile, not far from the village, Hung made his move. He walked slowly along the dirt path, his steps relaxed, his expression controlled. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what he was doing. As he entered the village, a few people glanced at him curiously. He wasn't familiar, but he didn't look out of place enough to raise alarm. His eyes scanned the surroundings quickly, the houses, the people, the newly built structures. Interesting, he whispered. Then he saw him. Jack. Standing near the bridge, talking to a group of villagers. Hung stopped for a moment, observing carefully. The confident CEO he once knew was still there, but different. Simpler. Calmer. But underneath, still sharp. A faint smile appeared on Hung's lips. So you really changed, he said quietly. Or at least, you think you did. He stepped forward. Jack. The voice cut through the noise just enough. Jack turned. For a brief second, his expression didn't change. Then recognition hit. Hung? The two men stood facing each other, the space between them filled with something unspoken, history, tension, and something else Jack couldn't immediately define. What are you doing here? Jack asked, his tone cautious. Hung shrugged lightly, a casual smile on his face. I heard a story. A man walks away from everything, then wins $10 million. I had to see it for myself. Jack's eyes narrowed slightly. And now that you've seen it? Hung looked around, then back at Jack. I'm impressed. Tu Tien, standing a few steps away, watched the interaction closely. There was something about Hung she didn't trust immediately, not his words, not his smile. Who is he? She asked quietly. An old friend, Jack replied, though his tone didn't fully match the word friend. Hung noticed that. His smile widened just a little. Not just a friend, Hung said. Someone who knows exactly who you used to be. The air shifted. Jack's posture straightened slightly. That was a long time ago. Was it? Hung asked, his eyes locking onto Jack's. Or is it just buried under all of this? He gestured toward the bridge, the village, everything Jack had been building. Jack didn't answer. Because for a brief moment, he wasn't entirely sure. Hung took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough that only Jack could hear. $10 million, Jack, he said. That's not a gift. That's a tool. Jack's gaze hardened. I decide how to use it. Hung chuckled softly. Of course you do. But the real question is, do you even know what it's really worth yet? Before Jack could respond, Hung stepped back, his expression returning to something lighter, more casual. I'll be around, he said. This place, it has potential. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving behind a silence heavier than before. Tu Tien stepped closer immediately. I don't like him. Jack didn't take his eyes off Hung's retreating figure. Neither do I. Then why does it feel like he's not here by accident? She asked. Jack didn't answer right away. Because deep down, he knew the truth. Hung didn't come to visit. He came for something. And whatever it was connected to the $10 million.